All right, so I'm Aron Pilhofer. I am the, and I always have to slow down when I say this because it's such a long title, the James B. Steele Chair in Journalism Innovation. I have never been able to do that yet without smiling because it's such a ridiculous title, but I'm actually really proud of that title because James B. Steele, whom you will see actually in one photo here, is one of my heroes, actually. One of the very early practitioners of data journalism. And so when the opportunity came up to take a position at Temple University in Philadelphia that was all around data journalism and journalism innovation, of course I jumped at it. And to even be even remotely associated with somebody like Jim Steele is kind of still a little bit strange and extremely humbling. So the title of the session today is Getting Started with Data Journalism, which is also a little ridiculous because this is in fact the last hour of data journalism training here at the conference. So we might have, I don't know, maybe next time around we might put this at the front end. But I think the point here that I'm going to try to convey is not necessarily in a very tactical way how to get started with data journalism. I'm not going to give you 14 quick and easy things you can do in Excel. There's lots of places you can get that. I'm actually going to talk in a more, in a broader sense about the idea of getting into data journalism, why and how, and in particular, trying to demystify a little bit about data journalism, which I think is really important. So I'll start first with some definitions. And data journalism isn't design, but design's really, really important. They often get conflated, but it's not. Data journalism isn't data publishing. If you saw Helena's presentation just in the last hour, she made this point as well. The mere act of publishing a database is not an act of journalism. It might be something a journalist does. It should be something a journalist does. But that itself is not journalism. It isn't data porn, quote unquote, although doing that kind of work is often very fun. This is a great piece that was making the rounds last week. This is every color cardigan sweater that Mr. Rogers, which is a children's show in the US, wore during his time on air, right? Wonderful, beautiful, lovely, absolutely meaningless, not a piece of journalism. And data, though, isn't the end. In fact, even though it's often portrayed that way, data journalism is, in my opinion, and I will die on this hill, is the means to the end. And so I guess if I'm going to put a definition of data journalism, it would be this. Data journalism means, to me, is simply using data as a source to create a piece of journalism. That's it. Toward a journalistic end. Now notice that in that definition is silent on whether that data is exposed to the public in some meaningful way, whether there's a visualization involved, whether there's even a number in the story. In fact, a former colleague of mine, and one of my heroes, Sarah Cohen, who is moving now to ASU to take a night chair, data journalism, she should be a multi-Pulitzer Prize winner. She's won one. She's been a finalist for second. She always says the best data story is a story without a number in it, and I couldn't agree more. Although sometimes I think we forget that. In fact, if you go way back in the Wayback Machine, and I have to say, a lot of these perceptions about data journalism, that it's all about numbers and that numbers are the thing, a lot of this is our fault. So we, those of us in this community, have some things to apologize for. If you go way back, you used to see stories all the time, and this is just one version of this phrase. You used to see data stories written all the time where it would include a sentence like, according to a computer-assisted analysis of data. Ooh, a journalist used a computer. So let's definitely point that out in our story because the reader is going to really care about that because that's really what's important. You used to see that kind of stuff all the time. And so a more modern version of that are these I mean, look, this is an amazing piece of data-driven journalism. There's no doubt about it. The piece that Derek Watkins is on the graphics team at the New York Times, and they visualized trillions of tons of flowing ice. And this isn't art. This is data. This is journalism. And he wrote this long blog post about how they did it and all the code behind it and all the rest of it. And ProPublica, they did this amazing piece, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, where they looked at how the marshlands and the waterways around Louisiana, around southern Louisiana, are melting away. And the way they did it, it's like science fiction. You know, if you read the story behind it, they're slinging all this code around, and they use these maps and all this and the rest of it. And then you see pieces like that, you know, from the Guardian US, where there are balls flying around the screen, and that's data journalism, and there's a lot of code involved there. And then, you know, this is an amazing piece that Helena had a lot to do with from the Guardian, and it looks great. And after a while, you start to think that data journalism, it's like this. It's fancy code and command lines and all these tools. And I'm here to tell you that actually it's not rocket science, that you should relax, okay? Just relax. Start from the start. Really, at its most fundamental, it's kind of this sort of stuff, right? It's sorting through data. What's the highest thing? What's the lowest thing? It's filtering. It's finding those little nuggets of goodness in a morass of numbers. It's aggregating. It's taking a bunch of like things and adding them together and counting and finding out that in fact, you know, this family that nobody's ever heard of is the biggest landowner in London. It's looking at how frequent something happens or how it compares to the baseline, our expectations, and it's measuring change. I mean, it's simple stuff. And I think that the reason why we for years, and I include obviously myself in this, the reason why I think we make this seem so much bigger and grander and more complicated than it is, it kind of comes down to respect in a way. And I'll get to that kind of at the end. When you're coming into a newsroom and you're doing something that's not traditionally perceived as a newsroom thing, there is a high incentive to differentiate what you're doing from what everyone else is doing, and to sort of try to put yourself in a different category. And so, I mean, it even comes into the titles that, you know, why are we data journalists? Why are we not just journalists? You know, why are we data reporters? There are people who are database editors for years, not just editors, they're database editors. And I really do think we're at a point where it's kind of time to stop thinking along these lines. And you know, and again, it's too bad that that this is at the very end. But these people who we're training here, this is a great way to start, because this is actually a lot of these sort of foundational things you can get right here. And I tell this to people when I go to conferences like this where we do these kinds of trainings. In fact, I used to start my training when I was doing Access and Excel by saying to people, and they rarely believed me, but it is actually true, that if you take 3 sessions of Excel and 3 sessions of Access, or I guess in this case it's SQL, we're doing SQL here, and you master those skills, right? Those things that you learn over, in this case, about 2 days, and nothing else, you'll have 85% of the skills you'll need to do 90% of the investigations that have ever been done in the sort of data journalism, computer assisted reporting, because actually it's really not that complicated. And so here's a tip. If there's one tool out there, and I know it's not super politically correct all the time because I'm a big open source software fanatic and I believe strongly in open source software and all the rest of it. But if there's one tool to master, it's this. It's Microsoft Excel, which is the Swiss Army knife of data journalism. You can do more in Excel today than you probably could have done with a database manager when I started doing computer-assisted reporting. And now the fundamental limits of what you can do within an Excel spreadsheet are huge. You can have like 1 million records of data in an Excel spreadsheet, whereas back when I started, you couldn't even do that in a database manager. And so if you're going to start with one tool, I would say this is it. Just master it. Good friend of mine, Matt Waite, his philosophy, which is how PolitiFact came to be, he and Bill Dedman collaborated on PolitiFact, on creating PolitiFact. And he's sort of the one who, at least for me, coined the phrase demos, not memos. You're never going to get the time you need to do this work. You're never going to get a boss saying, hey, you know what? Why don't you just take the next month? Don't worry about your beat. Don't worry about these stories. We'll cover it. Why don't you just take that time, a little bit of you time, and go work on that data piece? It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. There's very few people I know, and I include myself in this, who learned these skills and started doing these kinds of stories who were given the time to do them by their bosses just because their boss thought it would be a good idea. That just doesn't happen. And the way you convince bosses is by showing them something. It's by coming in with them and saying, hey, look at this. This is a good story. Bosses will give you the time to do a good story. They won't give you a time to learn the skills you need to do that might result in a good story. So demos, not memos. And what does that mean? That means you're going to have to do some of this work on the weekends, nights, 4 in the morning, and that's the reality. So, back in the prehistory, back when at the Courier News, I was working with a very talented reporter who also happened to be, he had at one point wanted to be a scientist, and so he had a very strong data background. He and I were collaborating on we had an idea for a story, and we had one computer in the newsroom that was capable, really, like, that everybody used for this kind of work, and we just stole time on it, the two of us, until we had something to show someone. And then we took that in to the editor and said, hey, this is a story. We should do this story. And then, and only then, they cut us loose to do that story. But there's no way. If we had to come in and said, oh, we suspect we could do this piece on flooding, and if we use the data in this way, we could show that actually it's this crazy amount of building that's been going on. It's impermeable surface. It's all these parking lots where cornfields used to be. That's what's actually causing this spike in flooding, right? Or that what is correlated with it. So demos, not memos. You're never going to get anywhere else. I'm a big proponent of collaboration, and not all data journalists are. In fact, there are many friends of mine who have very specifically, even though they do this job, they believe they're so frustrated actually collaborating on stories that they just sort of refuse to do it. And they sort of went into this mode of being, look, I'm a journalist and I happen to do data, but I'm not here to help you do data, right? The royal you. I'm not here to serve you. And I can understand why they feel that way, because it is really frustrating to be the person in the newsroom without whom these stories could happen. Did that make sense? Without whom these stories could happen. Yeah, I think that's right. But then to have your work relegated to research or to be treated like you're, effectively the librarian in the room, right? That's why they do it. So when I created the data projects team, which Helena up there runs, I specifically said that this team is not here to just be collaborative, they're here to be aggressively collaborative. And what did I mean by that? What I meant is, you're not here to just be a resource for the newsroom, you're here to convert the newsroom, right? You are here to be collaborative, but you are here to also be a missionary, to go out into the newsroom and find those corners, even the most reluctant collaborators, find those people and work with them. And use ways, find ways to surface these stories that should have a data component to them, because there's nothing more frustrating than reading something in the paper online that's just a pile of anecdotes that there's a freaking database that would have made that story solid, right? There's nothing more frustrating than that. And so that's what we did. Now, the bargain there was you got to back those people up. When that reporter is treating you like, in a previous job, one of my colleagues was working with one of the, let's just say, more difficult members of the investigative team, who one day turned to her and said, well, a trained monkey can do what you're doing. Really? A trained monkey, huh? But we got to work through these situations, right? And we got to understand that without bringing the newsroom as a whole up to speed, without being there, without having this collaborative attitude, yes, you will individually put out better stories, but the newsroom will continue as a whole, the newsroom will suffer. The organization will suffer. So I'm a big believer in being aggressively collaborative. So some ways that the team does that. Training is the big one, or was a big one. And it's not fun always when you want to be working on a story or have a big story to get stuck in a basic Excel class for the umpteenth time, often teaching the same reporters the same thing because they were there in your class 6 months ago, but they didn't really use it, and then they're back. Or just having very stubborn reporters who are there, they're forced to go there, their editor told them to go there, they don't know why they're there. So it can be kind of frustrating. But then there are those moments where once in a while, some of those people, you convert them. A light will go on, a little spark. Something they'll say to you, a story they're working on, maybe. And suddenly you realize, oh, you know what? This training thing actually can go both ways. Yes, they get a little something out of it, but you can too. You can start to find some co-collaborators, some co-conspirators even sometimes. The training is good for that. It has to be a partnership, though. And that's where it's really key that you establish that relationship up front. And that you understand if there are people in this room who are working with specialists, who are lucky enough to have specialists in their newsrooms to work with, having that partnership established up front, and I'll talk about a little bit more what I mean by that in a minute, is key. But they also, in the end, can set an example for the newsroom that can, in itself, provide incentive for more people to come to you. So this is how I see it. You aggressively collaborate. You are out there. You are a missionary. You are bringing the good word about data journalism, good news about data journalism to the newsroom, and you're trying to convert them to your cause. But you're doing so as an equal, you're doing so as a peer, you're doing so with an established relationship. And you're doing so with the idea that the entire newsroom ultimately gets better. And ultimately, by doing this, you demystify a lot of this bit about data journalism, that it is this thing that's only for magical people who can write code, because it's not. Or it shouldn't be. And I think it's really unfortunate that that's sort of how we perceive it. And finally, if you're very, very lucky, it institutionalizes the idea that data journalism is something we all need to be doing and that it belongs in the newsroom, that it's an essential function. And I really, really worry about that bit, that we're not quite there yet. In the States, we're sort of there. In the UK, I'm seeing some very, very positive signs. Europe, the rest of Europe, it's a little hit and miss. But I don't know if we're quite there yet, where people see this as an essential part of what we do. Now, I personally don't understand it. Because when you think of how much of all of our lives, public records, just public records, how much is held electronically and available to us electronically now, I mean, forget how much data we could create. Forget how much data we can scrape. Just think about public records. How are we still even having this discussion? It's sort of mind-boggling to me, but we are. But over time, I think by doing this, you can institutionalize this in the newsroom. And this goes both ways. Those of you here who are doing sort of data journalism jobs, and you know who you are. Actually, I know who you are. I think you need to think about how to institutionalize what you're doing. That is actually the higher calling in a sense, right? And those of you who don't have the resources or access to people to work with need to start asking why, or how that can be fixed, or how you can become that person. Because actually, as the profession shrinks, as this moves forward, having skills that other people don't have, it's a really important thing. It's a really good way of differentiating yourself from other people around you. The thing that also blows my mind when in my experience working with reporters, collaborating with reporters, a lot of times strange things happen. You can work with the most aggressive, dogged, investigative journalist on the planet. Someone who, if your phone rang and you were an elected official and that person was on the other end, you might quietly just hang it up and start writing your resignation letter. People like that, right? I work with a few people like that. And sometimes those people, though, when confronted with data, they suddenly go into this almost catatonic state where they regress into a state where they have no questions, they will not question, they will not get involved, you're the expert, they don't want to know about it, just give me the numbers and leave me alone and don't bother me with this data stuff, right? And sometimes it's because they're impatient, sometimes it's because, well, other reasons, sometimes it's because they're afraid. But if I could give advice, do not be afraid, do not stop asking questions, do not stop being aggressive, particularly when you're writing a data story. That's exactly the time when you should be, because often that data story, the story itself, hangs on the work that you're doing with that data journalist. And if that work is wrong, your name is on that story just like theirs, hopefully. So that is actually the time to be the most aggressive and the most questioning. But more importantly, you should not stop asking questions of the data itself. You should truly become a collaborator. And again, if you were up listening to Helena in the last hour, she talked about a story where she and a reporter were working on, it was about property, and she sort of had a spreadsheet that they were both kind of working on, and he had his side and she had her side. And there was actual collaboration going on, and that's good. That's a good, healthy relationship. When you can see what each other is doing, when that sort of veil comes up and you know what's going on. You guys are then collaborating. It's not an exchange of data. It is a collaboration. And that is when you're a superhero. And I guess maybe the last tip I would give for reporters who are working with specialists, well, second to last, is that when you're in that kind of relationship, right, with a data reporter, and when you're working together, and when you're collaborating, spread the love. And how is the love spread in journalism? It's through a byline, okay? It is through a byline. Those are bylines. That is not a byline. Oh, wait. Whoops. Yes, those are bylines. And how do you know when this work is byline worthy? Well, here's a story that Rob Gebeloff, who's on the data team in the New York Times, he worked on with two other reporters about racial bias in the New York State prison system. Here's the third through 7th paragraph, 6th paragraph. Here's what that story would look like without Rob's work, right? If your story would look like that without Rob's work, that's a byline, all right? It's pretty straightforward. Now, of course, this is the New York Times, so you have to have a tortured anecdotal lead. So really, if you see what actually is here, that's the heart of the story. This is it. This is the thing that people are going to be quoting. This is the story right there. That is not a byline. That's not a byline. Okay, I've gotten that before. I one time wrote an extensive, reporter came up to me and asked me, this is back in the New York Times days, asked me for a detailed memo on 527 committees, which at that time were sort of the campaign finance loophole du jour in the US system, how you get money into politics legally but unethically, right? And this reporter was new on the beat, didn't know anything. So I wrote this person, I spent the entire weekend, wrote a memo that long, heard nothing. 2 weeks later, I open up the paper, there is my memo, pretty much word for word. He had interviewed one person, quote at the top, his byline, I contributed research. I did not work with that reporter again. That's not a byline, and that's a byline, okay? So just be clear about it. I don't know why, well, I do know why, okay? I do know why journalists are so fussy about bylines and why newsrooms, particularly ones that I've worked in, get so wrapped up on who gets a byline and who doesn't. I get it. I understand that that's the currency of the newsroom, and a single byline is better than a double byline. I get it. But again, if your story would look like that, that's a byline. And that is how you are a hero to the data team, okay? And the final tip I guess I'll give is if you did go to some of the trainings today, or if you thought about getting involved in this, you've thought about doing CAR, or data journalism, if you've maybe taken a few classes, if you've done it a couple of times, but you haven't used it, you have to start. I mean, there's just no two ways around it. It's sort of like speaking a language. If you don't use it, you will lose it. So find a way to take this knowledge and lock it in. Find a way to take what you've learned, however simple it is, use it, practice it. Find a story on your beat. You know what? There's practically every story on any beat could involve data in some ways. But use it. Use it every single day. automate something, collect something in a spreadsheet. Find a way to use it. And I know that's easy to say, and it's harder to do, but if you don't do it, you will lose it, and you'll find yourself back here next year taking Excel 1, saying, oh, this year I'm going to do it. Find a way to do it. And if you need help, if you need advice, there are amazing communities out there to help you with this, right? There's NICAR. NICAR is on the National Institute of Computer System Reporting. It's kind of the epicenter of data journalism in the States. They have a mailing list. I know it's a little old school. You can use that. There's the News Nerdery Slack channel. There's email. There are those 9 lovely people I showed you at the beginning of this. There's me. There's Helene up there. Use it. Find ways to use it. Let us help you. Because really, at this point, there's really no excuse, right? I can't think of a good reason not to. I can't think of a good reason not to start doing data journalism on just about every beat, including sports, including culture. I can't think of a good professional reason not to be doing it if you're worried about either getting a job or not losing a job, because it is the thing that will help differentiate you. And from the point of view, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, from the point of view of what news organizations are trying to accomplish from a business model perspective, data journalism is the kind of thing that is distinctive. It's the kind of thing that you are going to be writing stories, you are going to be publishing visualizations, you are going to be publishing graphics that no one else is going to have, right? That's the definition of distinctive journalism. That's why the New York Times is doubling down on this. That's why pretty much everyone's doubling down on this kind of work, I would hope. There's really no excuses. There's tons of resources. There's tons of free resources. There's really no excuses. So I'll take questions if there are any, but thank you.
Do you have any advice for finding databases that are maybe in different languages and making sense of them?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's a question I've never gotten. Do I have specific advice for getting data? Do you have any specific advice for that, Helena?
Depends on what you're looking for. I once looked for Spanish databases by learning what search was in Spanish, and then I did searches on websites for that word so that I could find databases. So I think that is one. I've looked at statistical agencies in different languages and things like that. So what I usually do in that case is sort of try to find, the Google Translate of the word that I'm looking for. But also find a journalist is actually usually the best tip in that. Try to find a journalist somewhere. IRE has a database of people. I've helped out a lot of people in Sweden when I was in Sweden to find data in Sweden, for instance, when they wanted to do that. So find a journalist, and usually actually my experience is that journalists are often quite happy when somebody from another country contacts them and wants help from them. So you might get, so my first tip is find a person who can help you. And second is sort of try to use Google's all sort of specific things so that you search for different files or search for a specific word on a specific website, for instance, and that sort of thing. That's what I would do.
Thank you.
Investigative Reporters and Editors, National Institute. It's the same organization. They're based at the University of Missouri. I've been around forever. And it's a community of largely US journalists, but there is a fairly substantial global community, particularly in the last few years. But the mantra at these conferences is, we help one another. We don't give you a story. We're not going to give away a story, but we will give you skills. We will give you knowledge. We will share what we know. And it is an incredible community for that. So that is, that's really good advice. Starting with going to IRE NICAR. Yeah, the NICAR L mailing list maybe. Or
what's your favorite data story you've ever worked
on? Actually, it's the school book. It's not a data story. I mean, that was a total labor of love, and it was an attempt to do something that didn't exist, and it succeeded in every way that matters except for one, which is why it ultimately failed. The education editor, the Metro editor changed, and the incoming Metro editor decided that she didn't really care that much about K through 12 education. And so that was the end of School Book, sadly, after 9 months. But it was probably the most collaborative project I've ever worked on because it included reporters, editors, developers, designers, UX people, but it also went beyond that. We talked to parents, administrators, teachers, I mean, you name it, students, and made something I thought that was really great. So that's probably my favorite. Yeah. All right.
I'm just interested in your thoughts on whether or not journalists may overdo data journalism. We may over-egg it and actually just damage it ourselves. Because I come at this very much as a kind of, I need to get on board with this, but equally I'm a little reluctant. But I see some of those graphics you showed earlier and the ping pong balls and things like that, and I just think, that I'm not sure the reader benefits.
Yeah. I sometimes I think it's really interesting to see how things have changed, right? If you, particularly on the data viz side, because you remember like 5 years ago, data visualization was going to save journalism. Remember that? Yeah, that worked out. So there was a point. I think it was like I think then Snowfall launched, and then everything was freaking Snowfall, and then D3 became kind of the thing, and then every single piece of journalism that had a visualization aspect, everything was flying around. And if I had to see another one of those graphics that had the balls that were scaled and they would bump into each other, I don't think you're necessarily wrong that there is a stage of, to quote Alan Greenspan, of what did he say? Exuberant. Oh God, what did he would know, right? Exuberant, irrational exuberance, right? There's always that stage, particularly when something is new, and then it kind of draws back. And it's really interesting. You see, like the New York Times, which was doing a lot of this. I mean, there was a point in time when you practically couldn't open a web page on the New York Times and not run into something moving around. And they've brought it back significantly. So I think it's cyclical, and I think there's just this kind of, and I'll go back to like the earlier stories I showed you, where every story where we used a computer to analyze a database had to have a sentence that said, according to a computer analysis of da 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 da. I mean, that used to be standard. And you did that in the kind of the same way. That was sort of the text version of the balls flying around. So I don't know. I think you're probably right, but I don't know that necessarily means that you should ignore it. I think it goes both ways. That's all. That's all I would say. Yeah. All right. Was this upbeat? The last couple of presentations I've done afterwards, people have said, that is so depressing. Was this all right? Was it upbeat? Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
Cheers.